I woke up before dawn, my stomach twisting with a mixture of dread and fierce anticipation. The sunrise filtered through the pale curtains of my small bedroom, painting everything in a quiet, glowing orange. Today was the day I would finally face my family, my older brothers, my aunt, a smattering of cousins, all of them convinced that I was weak. They honestly believed I'd show up trembling, begging for the smallest sliver of the inheritance. That's what they'd told me last week, when they reached out with thinly veiled smugness, demanding that I attend an urgent meeting at our family estate. I could still recall the words in my brother Edmund's email. "We need you here. This can't move forward without your presence. But you do well to remember your place." My place, he'd said, as if I never had won, as if I needed them more than they needed me. I refused to let that bitterness stay tangled in my mind, though it had threatened my sleep for weeks. In truth, I was steeling myself for an all-out battle. I planned to emerge victorious, no matter what. The family estate had once belonged to our parents, my mother's cherished farmland, my father's proud stone house that had stood for over a century. For years, I had avoided it because I couldn't bear to set foot on the land where I was never truly welcomed. I was the youngest child, the only daughter, and from the very beginning, I'd been dismissed as fragile and inconsequential. My brothers teased me for being too soft, while my aunt shook her head at my every ambition, pointing me toward a neat little corner in the family's affairs that required no real power. But today would change all that. Today, I wasn't stepping onto that gravel driveway as the timid little girl they remembered. Today, I was coming back as a woman who'd had enough, who had quietly built her own successes in the city. They had no clue how prepared I was, or the trump card I was about to lay on the table. By the time I got dressed, opting for a black blazer and fitted pants that never failed to make me feel both comfortable and formidable, the sun had risen fully. It was only a short drive to the estate, barely an hour, but my hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to send jolts of tension up my arms. Nonetheless, I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and pressed the accelerator. The hum of the engine was my only company, and I tried to keep my mind focused on my plan rather than the knot of anger building in my throat. I reached the estate around 8 in the morning. The property was enormous, spanning several acres of rolling green fields framed by a thick forest. And there, standing at the end of the driveway, was the house, 3 stories of aged stone, ivy creeping along its walls like an ever-present reminder of our family's attempts to hold on to something old and unchanging. I parked my car in front of the imposing wooden doors and paused for a moment, letting out a breath I'd been holding since I left my apartment. Then I saw my brother Edmund stalking across the courtyard with his usual air of entitled self-assurance. His features were much like mine, dark hair and light brown eyes, but they were set in a perpetual sneer. Next to him stood Gregory, our middle brother, arms folded tight across his chest. Their gazes flicked to my small sedan, and then to me. I knew the looks on their faces well. Mild contempt, laced with anticipation that I was about to walk into an ambush. I got out, smoothed my blazer, and nodded at them. Neither returned the greeting. Edmund was the first to speak. "We didn't think you'd have the nerve to show," he said. I let a small smile tug at my lips. "I'm here, aren't I?" His brow quirked. "That you are." No one offered to help me with my bag. I didn't mind. I was done with looking for basic courtesy. Instead, I followed them inside, the echo of our footsteps reverberating through the marble foyer. I couldn't help but feel a pang at the sight of the place. It still smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood, a scent that used to make me feel safe as a child. But time had warped those pleasant memories. Now the house was simply a stage for a confrontation. The main hall had been prepared for this so-called family meeting. Chairs were arranged in a circle, with a large desk stacked with files in the corner. Our aunt, Victoria, sat primly on one of the chairs, her posture rigid and her face drawn into a pinched expression. She shot me a glance over her thin reading glasses.
"There you are," she said.
"We were wondering if you'd turn up at all." I ignored the goading. I wouldn't miss it. As more family members trickled into the hall, my cousins, some of them with only a vague reason to be there. I felt the energy in the room shift. A thick tension settled among us. Clearly, most had come with the same intention, to watch me get humiliated. To see me, the black sheep, scramble for a piece of the inheritance my parents had left behind. Edmund, always desperate to have control, wasted no time. He cleared his throat and raised his voice, so everyone could hear. Let's get down to business. We've decided on the best course of action for the estate. As you all know, it passed to us collectively, myself, Gregory, and our dear sister, when our parents died. But negotiations with potential buyers have reached a snag. It seems that all rightful owners must sign off on the property before a sale can be finalized. He paused, letting his gaze settle on me. Our sister has been disinclined to come to terms with the rest of us. Aunt Victoria sniffed. Really, dear, you should think about the family. Holding out helps no one. I felt my pulse quicken. I forced calm into my voice. I've never said I wouldn't come to terms. I just wasn't keen on your terms. Gregory's gaze hardened. We've given you fair options. A quarter of the sale price is more than enough for you, if you just sign the papers. Fair. That word almost made me laugh. They were intending to sell the house and land for a fraction of its true worth. I discovered that after I made my own quiet inquiries. Edmund and Gregory stood to benefit nicely because they had deals made on the side, some scheme to develop the fields into commercial property. Meanwhile, the official contract they'd shown me had the estate listed at a suspiciously low price. They wanted to pay me the meager share that matched that artificially low figure. I stood tall, meeting Gregory's eyes. A quarter of a fraction is not fair. You both know the property's worth more than that. A hush fell over the room, and I felt the weight of many eyes. My aunt shifted in her seat, looking irritated at the possibility that I was armed with information they'd hoped I didn't have. Meanwhile, Edmund's face darkened. So, you think you know better? You've barely set foot in this house in years. How dare you waltz in now and act like you have any idea what's best for the estate? My chest burned with anger, but I kept my voice steady. I've done my research. I'm well aware that you're lowballing me on purpose. You want to sell the house at a cut-rate price to your friends or business partners, then make a fortune once the land's rezoned for commercial use. Gregory pursed his lips and gave a terse shrug, as if I'd only just stated the obvious. So what if we profit? This is a family matter. We have every right to do what we want with the property. And you're being offered something, aren't you? Isn't it enough that we're not cutting you out entirely? I shook my head. It's not just about the money. You're not respecting me or my rights. And I remember how you both tried to manipulate Mom and Dad before they died, hounding them to leave everything in your names. Edmund let out a short, humorless laugh. They never would have done such a thing. You're delusional. I let their jeering roll off me. I'd come armed with the leverage that counted. Then I guess we have no deal, I said simply. A ripple of whispers passed through the cousins. Aunt Victoria clicked her tongue. That's enough. We're in this room to settle matters. We'll talk specifics and then you'll sign. She didn't even phrase it like a question. The condescending tone struck me with full force. They fully expected me to cower, cornered by the threat that if I didn't sign, I'd never see a cent. I stared at them, my mind racing, but I forced a cool, patient expression. We'll see, I murmured. It's a long day ahead. We convened around a large rectangular table in what used to be the formal dining room. The polished oak surface gleamed under the overhead lights. My father had once held grand feasts here, and I recalled how, as a child, I was rarely seated at this table except for special occasions. I often ate in the kitchen, out of the way. Now, ironically, I was at the head of it, possibly for the first time ever. Edmund, Gregory, my aunt, and I were the main participants, while a few cousins flitted in and out. They were mostly there to gossip or perhaps witness my humiliation. Edmund had stacks of documents in front of him, and he pretended that he was something of an expert as he laid out the terms, pointing to paragraphs that conveniently favored him. My mouth set into a tight line as I tried to follow along, stifling my frustration at the contrived formality. Every other line, Edmund would shoot me a look, as if to say, "You're out of your league." Aunt Victoria kept piping up in her shrill voice, reinforcing whatever Edmund said. Yes, yes, that's correct, she'd repeat, apparently not even reading the lines in front of her. Gregory, for his part, just watched me. I could sense he was waiting for me to explode, or do something rash that might prove his low opinion of me. Instead, I was calm. Too calm, perhaps, because they started exchanging glances, wondering why I was so poised. Around noon, we broke for lunch. The tension was thick, nearly suffocating, and I could see that my aunt was exhausted by the constant drama. Still, she sniffed at me before leaving the room, as if this entire ordeal was my fault. Most of my relatives streamed into the adjacent kitchen or out onto the patio, forming little cliques of hushed chatter. I went outside for a moment to get a breath of fresh air. The midday sun beat down on the overgrown lawn. Beyond the house, the field stretched out in a rolling expanse of bright green. Even with all the hostility in the air, the land itself was as beautiful as ever. My mother had once walked these fields every morning, collecting wildflowers. She had always tried to encourage me to do the same, but I usually stayed in my bedroom to avoid running into my brothers. Now, ironically, this farmland might become the site of a massive commercial building, if they got their way. While I was gazing at the horizon, I heard a voice behind me. "You should really reconsider," Gregory said quietly, stepping up beside me. He shoved his hands into his pockets. "I don't like that we're all butting heads. I know you don't care about me or Edmund. But do you really want to make enemies out of the whole family?" I exhaled slowly. "I'm not making enemies. I just want my fair share." He shrugged. "You were always too stubborn for your own good." Then he looked directly at me, something like pity flickering across his face. "But I guess I forgot that you're not a kid anymore. You actually know how to stand up for yourself." My laugh sounded hollow, even to my own ears. "Funny you say that, considering how often you and Edmund try to keep me from standing up in the first place." He pressed his lips together, as though struggling to come up with a response. Finally, he let out a dismissive sound. "This is bigger than any old squabble. If you push this too far, we'll all suffer. The estate might fall through. None of us will get a decent deal, and the only thing we'll have left is a rotting house with a bunch of bickering relatives. You should have thought about that before planning to cheat me." He offered a terse nod and turned away, leaving me alone with the grass swaying in the breeze. For a moment, I let the anger break free inside me. Did they honestly think I was just some naive little girl who'd buckle at the first sign of pushback? Did they think I'd risk everything, come all this way just to fold? I felt the knot of determination grow tighter in my chest. I was going to claim what was rightfully mine, and if they wanted to push me to the sidelines, I would push back. We reconvened after lunch. Everyone seemed even more on edge, as if the midday heat only increased their irritation. Edmund fiddled with a pen, tapping it on the table, while my aunt perched on the edge of her seat, glaring at me. The discussion started circling around the same few points, repeating like a broken record. "You'll get a quarter," Edmund would say. "It's not enough," I'd reply. "Sign the agreement," Aunt Victoria would snap.
No.
It was mind-numbingly repetitive. No new ground was gained. They thought my resolve would crack under the pressure, but they were wrong. As the afternoon rolled on, it looked like we were headed for a deadlock. My cousins started murmuring among themselves, bored with the stalemate. Even Aunt Victoria was massaging her temples. I bided my time, continuing to push back. Then, shortly after 4 in the afternoon, I decided the moment had come. I glanced at my watch, then stood up, looking directly into Edmund's eyes. "We've been dancing around in circles all day," I said. "Let's cut to the chase. You have a copy of the proposed sale agreement. I'd like to see it again, along with any side deals you've already made." His face gave a barely perceptible twitch, as if he was worried. He tried to keep his voice smooth. "There are no side deals." I raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Aunt Victoria jumped in. "We've disclosed everything that needs disclosing. You either sign, or you get nothing." My heart pounded. This was the moment. "Actually," I began, clearing my throat, "that's not entirely accurate. I've come prepared to offer you something else." Edmund and Gregory exchanged a quick, sharp look. The cousins fell silent. For the first time all day, I had the undivided attention of everyone at the table. I reached into my bag and pulled out a file of my own. I opened it, revealing official documents with crisp black print. "I have my own buyer," I said calmly, tapping the pages. "But in this scenario, I'm not simply waiting for a handout. I'm buying you all out." Dead silence. Aunt Victoria frowned so deeply that lines etched themselves across her forehead. Edmund's mouth opened and closed as if he was trying to form words but couldn't. It was Gregory who found his voice first. "What are you talking about?" I slid the documents toward the center of the table. "I've partnered with a private investment group. I've saved, I've worked, and I've got enough capital to propose an immediate buyout of your shares in the estate. I'd become the sole owner. Of course, the amount I'm offering is more than fair, because the property is worth more than you were letting on." Edmund snorted, though it sounded forced. "That's ridiculous. You think you can just buy the whole property? Why would we agree to that?" I met his stare without flinching. "Because it's more money than you'd get from your underhanded deal. My backers are offering a substantial sum. You'll still turn a profit. You all walk away with no further obligations, and the land remains in the family, albeit solely with me." Aunt Victoria shot up from her chair, glaring at me. It's preposterous. We had a deal in place." I shrugged. "You had a plan, not a deal. And I'm free to propose alternatives. No legitimate buyer would finalize a purchase without my signature anyway. You're at an impasse unless I agree, and I won't, not with your insult of an offer." Gregory's voice turned to ice. "How do we know you're not bluffing?" Keeping my composure, I slipped a second set of papers from the folder, signed letters of intent from reputable financiers. "It's all here. Check the signatures if you'd like. I've been working with these people for months. They believe in the estate's potential for farmland preservation, or even a possible vineyard. They love the aesthetic. They'd let me maintain ownership and operate it with a new vision. You walk away with a handsome sum, and I get to carry on what Mom and Dad wanted, to keep the land as something meaningful, not just another warehouse parking lot." A hush spread through the room. No one moved. I could practically see the gears turning in Edmund's head. He was calculating whether he could come up with a better arrangement. The problem for him was that he'd lose the chance for a shady-side deal that would line his pockets. But if he turned me down, he risked losing everything if I refused to sign off on his cheap sale. Finally, Aunt Victoria drew a breath. "I can't believe you do this to us," she snapped. "You're just proving that you don't care about the family. You only care about your pride." My stomach twisted, but I stayed composed. "Actually, I care about honoring what our parents built. You're the ones who wanted to bulldoze it into a commercial lot for some quick cash. If you think about it, my plan keeps our family legacy alive." Her mouth formed a thin line. There's no guarantee you can handle an estate of this size on your own. Do you even understand the cost of upkeep? Do you have any idea how burdensome it is?" "That's my concern," I answered sharply. "Not yours. If you truly think it's such a headache, you should be glad I'm willing to shoulder it and pay you generously for that privilege." I could hear faint murmurs among the cousins. They seemed torn. After all, many of them simply wanted a nice payout. If I was offering more money, they had every reason to accept. But I could also sense their disbelief that I, the youngest, quietest family member, had orchestrated something so audacious. Edmund's face was stormy. For years he had lorded over me, calling me foolish or timid. Now I had the upper hand, and it was obvious he despised the new power dynamic. "You think you can just be the boss of us?" he finally spat. "Throw money in our faces like you're better?" I shook my head, letting a little edge seep into my tone. "I'm not throwing money around. I'm offering to buy a property we all inherited, but that you're trying to flip for cheap. If it's about fairness, I'm giving you more than you'd give me. Yes, I'm the boss of me, and if that terrifies you, I can't help that." Gregory shuffled the documents in front of him. His expression was drawn. "This is insane," he muttered. "How the hell did you manage to pull this off?" I lifted my chin. "I've worked hard for years, building relationships, saving money, carefully investing. You two never asked me about my life in the city. You just assumed I was floundering somewhere. Your arrogance is the reason you never saw this coming. There was a dangerous pause, during which I half expected Edmund to rip the papers to shreds in front of me. Instead, he shoved them away, crossing his arms. I'm not signing over anything. This is a power play, and I'm not going to fall for it. That triggered a wave of anxious glances among the cousins. Aunt Victoria fidgeted as well, knowing that if Edmund held out, the sale might be tied up in legal battles for months, maybe years. My relatives didn't have the stamina or resources for that kind of fight. Slowly, I saw expressions change as they realized the harsh truth. Even if they wanted to call my bluff, it would cost them dearly in lawyers' fees and wasted time. My buyout was a guaranteed windfall, right here, right now. I could sense some of them wanted to persuade Edmund, but they were too nervous to confront him in front of everyone. So we sat there in silence, the tension suffocating, until Aunt Victoria broke it. "Let's all have some air," she said in a strangled voice. "We need time to discuss this privately." I nodded graciously. Of course. The family filed out, gathering in the hallway and other rooms, leaving me alone at the table. I sank into a chair, breathing in short bursts. My pulse hammered, but I tried to calm myself. This was the biggest risk I'd ever taken. If Edmund really decided to fight me, I'd be in for a nasty, protracted legal battle. My documents were in order, but the outcome was never guaranteed when you had deep-pocketed relatives willing to play dirty. But I had to believe in my plan. The reason I'd waited this long was to secure the finances and partnerships I needed to stand on my own. I'd consulted attorneys. I knew what I was doing, at least, as much as anyone could in such a stormy situation. This was how I took back my power, how I made sure the legacy my parents left behind wouldn't be exploited by those who had never cared about it in the first place. I took a moment to walk around the room, my footsteps echoing on the parquet floor. I noticed the chipped paint on the walls, the dusty corners. This house was old, in dire need of love and repair. But I saw potential. For me, it represented everything I'd once felt I lacked: security, belonging, warmth. Now, ironically, it might become something that truly belonged to me. The hours wore on, with the sun dipping lower in the sky. By the time the family trickled back, the golden light of late afternoon poured through the windows, giving everything a strange glow. They returned to the table slowly, as if each step took immense effort. I braced myself. Would they try a last-ditch attempt to bully me? Or would they realize that I held all the cards? Aunt Victoria took her seat, refusing to look me in the eye. She cleared her throat. "We've spoken," she said in a stiff tone. "Not everyone is in agreement. But we recognize that we're at a stalemate. You, my dear, hold up the entire sale if you don't sign. And you're offering a buyout in good faith. We must do what's best for the family as a whole." My heart thumped loudly. This sounded promising. But I didn't relax yet. Edmund sat with a scowl carved into his face. "I'm against it. Let that be noted. I don't want you to think for a second that I support this. If it were up to me." "It is up to you." I cut in gently, in that you can choose to keep your share and do nothing. Of course, you'll end up in a protracted legal fight because I'm not letting you sell to your associates. That's your choice, Edmund. But the rest of the family, including Aunt Victoria, might have a problem with that. My aunt clicked her tongue impatiently. "We can't afford a legal war, Edmund. It would wipe out any benefit. We have to be practical." A bitter laugh escaped him. "You call this practical? Handing everything over to the baby of the family so she can play lady of the manor?" Something inside me flashed white-hot with indignation, but I forced a placid smile. "I'm hardly playing. I've done my homework, and I have legitimate investors behind me." He inhaled through his nose, his nostrils flaring with anger. For a moment, I honestly thought he might flip the table. But then Gregory spoke up in a careful tone. "I've seen the letters. They look real, Ed. Even if we wanted to fight this, we might not win. And we'd spend a fortune in the process." Edmund glared at him, then turned that glare on me. "Fine," he said. "Have your victory. But don't come crying to me when you can't handle the upkeep on this place. Don't come begging for help. I stood silent, letting his bitterness wash over me. Then I squared my shoulders. I'll be fine. There was a long moment when no one spoke, as if the entire day's tension had locked all our tongues. Finally, my aunt reached for the documents in front of her. "Let's get it over with, shall we?" she muttered. She flipped through, scanning for the signature lines. She paused a few times, making sure the official sale sum matched what we'd told her. I watched her expression shift from resentment to reluctant acceptance. One by one, the families signed the contract. Aunt Victoria, the cousins who had direct stakes, then Gregory. Each stroke of the pen felt like a small quake in the ground under my feet. I realized, with a surge of adrenaline, that this was actually happening. I was about to own the entire estate. Finally, it came to Edmund. He stared at the line in silence, pen in hand. My gut churned in that moment, worried he might find a way to sabotage everything. He looked at me, his lips pressed so tight they were white. Then, almost carelessly, he scribbled his signature. He threw the pen on the table. "You think this makes you powerful? It just means you've inherited a huge headache." I held his gaze. "Maybe, but I'm prepared for that." He scoffed, stood abruptly, and stomped out of the dining room. The door slammed behind him, shaking the old walls. His footsteps pounded down the corridor, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For a few moments, nobody moved. Aunt Victoria folded her glasses and stared at me. There was anger there, resentment, but maybe a flicker of something else, resignation, acceptance, or possibly a grudging respect. "Well," she said at last, "I suppose you're the lady of the house now." I couldn't help but let a bittersweet smile touch my lips. "Yes, I suppose so." She exhaled sharply. "This family, we never thought you'd. Well, I suppose we underestimated you." A faint prickle of triumph danced along my spine. But I kept my voice even, not wanting to gloat. "I just did what any of you would have done if you had the means and the chance." Her lips pursed. She looked like she wanted to say something cutting, but she held back. "I expect you'll be staying here then? Or do you plan to tear the place down?" My chest tightened at the accusation. I'd never tear it down. This was our parents' home. I planned to renovate it, maybe open it to the public in some capacity. But mostly I want to preserve it and the farmland. That's why I formed the partnership with my investors. They appreciate historic properties. She looked away, tapping her fingers against the table. "I'll be curious to see how you manage it. Goodbye, child. I wish I could say I wish you well, but I'm still processing." Her voice was stiff, and I knew it was the closest thing to civility I'd get from her. The cousins lingered only a short while longer. Some offered me half-hearted congratulations, realizing that, for better or worse, I was the new owner. Others just scurried off, eager to avoid any confrontation. They'd already signed, so there was nothing more to be done except wait for the funds to transfer. I'd arranged for the wire transfers to go through by tomorrow morning, but legally, with their signatures, the estate was essentially mine. When they all left, the quiet in the house was deafening. I stood in the foyer, hearing the creaks of the old floorboards under my feet. The place seemed bigger than ever now that it belonged to me. A swirl of conflicting emotions gripped me: triumph, relief, sadness at how everything had gone down. I felt drained, as if I'd fought a war in a single day. In a sense, I had. I made my way slowly into the living room. Dust motes floated in the late afternoon sunlight, drifting in golden beams through the tall windows. I remembered sitting on the floor here as a child, flipping through my mother's old photo albums. It had been so many years since I'd let myself think about that memory. Now, the house was mine to do with as I wished. Part of me wondered whether I should track Edmund down and try to talk to him. But I knew better than to chase after him right now. His temper was raging. Nothing I said would calm him down or change his mind about me. That would take time if it was even possible. I let that concern slip away. He had his money, far more than he deserved if you asked me. Let him be angry. He'd underestimated me for my entire life. Now, at least, he couldn't take this victory away. Night began to fall, and I flipped on the old chandelier in the foyer. I needed to decide whether to stay in the house tonight, all by myself, or head back to my apartment. The practical choice was to go back to my place. But I felt an inexplicable pull to stay. This was my home now. I had spent so much of my childhood feeling as though I had no safe haven, no real acceptance here. Now, ironically, it was mine outright. I wanted to spend at least one night under this roof. I made a quick meal from the supplies left in the kitchen, rummaging through cupboards that had once been stocked by my mother. I found a dusty kettle and boiled water for tea, remembering how she used to make a fresh pot every morning. My heart twisted in longing for her, for the father who used to invite me into his study to teach me about the family's history. It still hurt that they were gone, that my relationship with the rest of the family had turned so sour, culminating in today's confrontation. But perhaps this was the start of something new. Maybe I could transform this house into a place of warmth again. After eating, I wandered through the rooms. The furniture was still mostly the same, though covered in sheets to protect it from dust. I found the library upstairs, a small room crammed with shelves of old books. My father had loved to read in his chair by the window, and I used to curl up on the rug, listening to him. The smell of old paper was comforting, reminding me of simpler times. I gently brushed my fingers along the spines. Maybe I'd eventually restore this room, polish the shelves, replace the worn rug. The day's events weighed heavily on me, but a blossoming sense of hope kept me awake. Finally, around 9 in the evening, I climbed the creaking staircase to the master bedroom, my parents' old room. I hesitated on the threshold, uncertain if I was ready to claim it as my own. But I felt somehow that I needed to. If I was going to own this house, truly own it, I had to step into every room, even the ones that held painful memories. The air was stale, and the curtains were drawn. I turned on the lights, which flickered a little before settling into a warm glow. The bed was still made, as if waiting for my parents to return. Dust lined every surface. I stood there, letting the quiet wash over me. Tears pricked at my eyes, surprising me with their sudden intensity. So many memories crowded in at once. My mother's gentle laugh, my father's strong voice when he stood up to extended family on my behalf. I sank onto the edge of the bed, letting out a shaky breath. The finality of everything hit me full force. I'd spent the day locked in a brutal battle with my relatives, who had insisted I didn't matter, that I should settle for crumbs. Now they were gone, and I was left with the entire estate, a dusty bedroom, and a sea of complicated emotions. But beneath the sorrow, triumph glowed. I had won. They had expected me to beg, to cower, to accept whatever scraps they offered. Yet here I was, the sole owner of the estate. I'd face them all, unmask their schemes, and come out on top. A surge of pride mingled with grief, swirling through me until I wiped my cheeks dry. I kicked off my shoes, unbuttoned my blazer, and lay back against the pillows. Through the open windows, I heard the night wind rustling the nearby trees. Crickets chirped in the distance, and the old house made faint settling sounds. Normally, a big, empty place like this might feel unsettling, but tonight it felt like a new chapter in my life. A bit lonely, yes, but also filled with opportunity. As I stared up at the ceiling, the weight of the day began to press down on me, finally making my eyes drift shut. I pictured how it had all begun that morning. Me, behind the wheel of my little car, worried but determined, driving up the estate's winding driveway. I recalled the fear that churned in my belly as I walked through the front doors. Now the day was nearly over, and everything was irrevocably changed. For a moment, my mind flicked to Edmund's final words, "Don't come crying to me when you can't handle the upkeep." A part of me knew there would be challenges, massive ones. Maintaining this property wouldn't be easy. I'd have to deal with contractors, renovations, financial planning, and who knew what else. But the thought didn't frighten me. Not really. Compared to facing a hostile room of relatives ready to cheat me out of what was mine, tackling repairs felt almost straightforward. Maybe someday, if I was patient, I could even invite the rest of the family back, if their attitudes changed. I imagined hosting a gathering in this house, after the renovations were complete, showing them what I'd built. Would they still resent me for taking it all, or would they be impressed by what I'd accomplished? I couldn't know, but at least I'd have the satisfaction of trying. My limbs grew heavy, and I let out a long sigh. I should turn off the lights, I thought, forcing myself to sit up. I flicked the switch on the nightstand lamp, plunging the room into a soft, moonlit glow. The tension in my body released, and I sank into the mattress, drifting into half-sleep. Before I lost consciousness, a memory surfaced, gentle and bittersweet. My mother teaching me how to waltz in this very room, her laughter echoing off the walls as I stumbled over my small feet. I'd been no more than 6 years old, and she'd said, "One day, you'll do great things. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Her encouragement had often felt like a distant whisper, overshadowed by the daily scorn from the others. But in the end, she'd been right. Now, nearly a lifetime later, I was embracing that promise. I felt a tear slip down my cheek. This time it wasn't from sadness, but from a deep sense of gratitude and relief. I imagined my parents looking down at me from wherever they might be, smiling at the knowledge that their youngest, the overlooked daughter, had fought for the legacy they'd worked so hard to build. I let my eyes close. I'd survive the day, come out triumphant, and in the morning, I'd begin the daunting but exciting task of breathing new life into the old estate. I promised myself I'd preserve the farmland and respect its history, just as my mother did when she walked these fields. Tomorrow, I'd wake up as the rightful owner of this place, no longer the forgotten daughter in anyone's eyes, most importantly, not in my own. I slept better that night than I had in years, cradled by the hush of the house that was finally, in every sense, mine.